Welcome back, everyone. We are now about to launch into section 4, which is going to be a step-by-step walkthrough of the PI planning event. Let's get started with a look at the topics we'll be covering in this section. Section 4 of the course is organized into 3 parts. In the first part, we'll cover the PI planning process, basic purpose, inputs, outputs, and the agenda for the PI planning event itself. Next, we'll go through each of the 2 parts of the PI planning event. Part 1 includes the steps needed to get to a first pass PI plan. And specifically, in that part, we'll cover how to break features into stories, how to derive estimates for the features, and how to come up with a first pass scope estimate and feature delivery timeline. We'll also look at the creation of an initial set of PI objectives. Then in part 2 of the planning event, we'll cover steps needed to align the art on a final plan for the PI, including a final feature delivery plan, visualized in the art planning board, scoring of PI objectives, and then risk reviews and confidence vote. So what is the purpose of PI planning? PI planning is an event whose purpose is to align business stakeholders and all teams on an art to a shared vision and set of business objectives for the next PI. So our starting point is the art backlog. The art backlog is a stack ranked list of product features and technology infrastructure items targeted for the next PI. Let's also remind ourselves that the art backlog was not pulled out of thin air, but is derived from strategy and ultimately serves the purpose of delivering a set of business goals for the next PI, and that these business goals in turn contribute to the realization of an overarching vision for the product. So one of SAFE's core values is alignment, which requires constant communication of the vision and strategy across the organization. This is a key responsibility of the art product manager. This helps ensure that the work being performed by delivery teams on an art is firmly connected to a strategy and a vision. Now let's review the basic inputs and outputs for the PI planning process. The primary input, as we have discussed at length in section 3, is the art backlog. The art backlog is a ranked list of defined features and other items. In the last section, we reviewed a template for these backlog items and also a method for ranking the backlog so that items of highest business value are delivered first. Then on the output side, we have 2 major outputs. First, a feature delivery plan confirming which features can be delivered based on team capacities, and an approximate delivery timeline showing feature delivery estimates to the nearest sprint. This is then all summarized in an artifact called the art planning board. Then we have a set of PI objectives from each team. PI objectives are business summaries of what each team expects to achieve during the PI. We'll be talking more about PI objectives later in this section. Now let's go through the PI planning event agenda. The event is split into 2 parts. Part 1 is to get to a first pass set of plans from all teams and to identify major risks, dependencies, and general disconnects as early as possible in the process so that they can be addressed. That usually takes a full day to get through, though we'll discuss some options for event format and logistics in just a minute. Part 1 involves first setting the stage with a business update and review of goals and priorities presented by the product manager. Next, we'll hear from the system architect about any major architecture updates or major technology changes and their implications. Then the RTE should provide a quick refresh on the process steps and expectations for the PI planning event. Then we'll have the first major breakout session where teams will create first pass plans. This involves first breaking features into stories, estimating stories and features, and confirming the scope of what can be achieved in the PI. Then figuring out an approximate delivery timeline for features. This is to the nearest sprint. And then coming up with a draft set of PI objectives. Then each team presents their plans, highlighting major risks, dependencies, disconnects on scope. And then once all teams are presented, the leadership team meets to attempt to resolve any major problems and to identify some actions for the teams that they will share when the event reconvenes the next day or the next session. In part two, the leadership will first of all communicate any planning adjustments. These may be things like help with risks, impediments, priority changes, scope changes, or additional development capacity needed to address any major scope shortfalls. Teams will then break out again to incorporate these adjustments and reflect these in updated plans. That is, feature scope and scheduling, updated PI objectives. Once all that is done, teams will then present their updated plans. At this point, PI objectives are scored by business stakeholders. We'll be describing that in detail coming up soon. A risk review is conducted, and then a confidence vote in the overall plan is held. The event then concludes with a fairly simple retrospective to get feedback and suggestions for improvement. Now let's review some of the options for the PI planning event format and logistics. One approach is to hold a so-called big room planning event. This is where we get all teams, that is everyone on the art plus stakeholders, gathered together in one physical location. A large conference facility, for example, with enough space to accommodate all of the participants, maybe up to 150 people. The advantage of this approach is that it enables face-to-face communication, which is a basic principle from the Agile Manifesto, promotes relationship building, so we're going to have dinner and social activities usually at the event, and also has the advantage of having the answers to questions, both business and technical questions, available in pretty much real time. The disadvantage, of course, is the obvious expense associated with this sort of event, especially with the need to fly in teams from multiple geographies. And also, of course, in the year 2020, big room planning was effectively derailed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and so the event had to shift to online and virtual formats. With a virtual event, the idea is not simply to have everyone in a virtual big room at the same time, that is big room planning on video, but make at least some of the planning activities operate asynchronously, that is enable teams to plan independently and in their own time zones without tying everybody up on a 2-day conference call. This event can be a mix of synchronous activities and checkpoints where everyone is on the same call at the same time, and some events, specifically the team breakouts, where teams do much of the detailed planning independently. The virtual event can take longer, especially with an art dispersed across multiple time zones and where we might have a mix of morning and evening events to accommodate everyone. Note that PI planning takes place during the last iteration of the PI, that is during the innovation and planning iteration, in which time is specifically reserved for planning. There are many possible permutations of the virtual version of the event, and you are encouraged to experiment and find something that works well for your organization. Now let's look at one possible approach to distributed PI planning. So in this model, we want teams to be able to plan as independently as possible, but with checkpoints built in to synchronize on goals and synchronize on progress. So in the example here, we have a five-step process. Steps 1, 3, and 5 are synchronous. That is, we have all teams and stakeholders on a conference call to synchronize on goals and progress. Whereas steps 2 and 4, teams work independently to create and adjust their plans. And so with the distributed version of the PI planning event, we may need more time to complete all the required steps. So each team breakout step may need up to a full day, and the entire process may require 3 to 5 days to complete overall. But with experience, we should be able to get this down to 3 days or less. In the next part of this section, we're going to do a detailed step-by-step walkthrough of how to create our first pass plans. In this lesson, we'll cover the steps needed to get to a first pass plan for the PI, including how to break features into stories, how to derive estimates for stories and features, and how to come up with a first pass overall scope estimate for the PI from each team. And then an estimated delivery timeline for each of the features. We'll also look at creation of an initial set of PI objectives. And finally, we'll discuss the last step of part 1, which is the leadership review, in which the leadership team looks at the risks, impediments identified by the teams, and decides what actions can be taken to address these issues. So let's look at the standard agenda for part 1 of the event. And the timeline presented in the table is for a big room style event. You may need to tailor this to better fit the specific format and logistics you have in place for your own event. So the event kicks off with a business update and then a review of goals and priorities from the product manager, plus any other guest speakers. This is important to provide the context against which the goals have been set for the PI and to continue to promote alignment across the organization. Now, at this point, there should not be any major surprises in terms of goals or priorities, as there should have been much discussion on this front during the process of creating and refining the art backlog. But it is very important to keep having this conversation for the purpose of strengthening alignment across the organization and within the art. Next, we'll have the RTE provide a refresh on the steps for both parts of the event. Now, unless this is the very first planning event for the organization, we should not need anything like the 90 minutes indicated, though this may typically include lunch if it's a in-person event, in which case we should be able to free up some time for the breakout sessions. Then we'll have the team breakouts where the detailed planning takes place. This can happen asynchronously, especially if the event is a virtual one. Following that, everyone gets back together in the room or on a conference call to have each team present their plans. And finally, we have the leadership problem-solving session to identify any adjustments that may be needed either in terms of PI goals or scope or priorities. We're now going to walk through a summary of the steps to get to an estimate of what each team has the capacity to deliver in the next PI. So we have this 5-step process. 2 of these steps should have been completed prior to the PI planning event. We just want to restate them here for emphasis. That is, features have been refined and ranked because we will not have the time to do this during PI planning. And in particular, features should have acceptance criteria defined. This is crucial to help define needed functionality and hence to identify user stories for the feature. We are looking at an example where an individual team has 8 features, features 1 through 8, for which they need to come up with a plan. And the example feature 1 has been broken into 4 user stories, and the estimates for these stories add up to a total of 18 points, which gives us an estimate for the feature. The estimate for the feature is simply the sum of the story estimates. We're going to provide some guidance on how we do both feature to story decomposition and story estimating. This is just a summary of the steps in this slide. So we should proceed feature by feature in rank order, first identifying stories for each feature and then estimating those stories and points to get to a total feature estimate. Now note that these stories at this point are not expected to meet a definition of ready, but have sufficient information to indicate the intent of the story. So let's take an example where a team has a velocity of 30 and we're planning 6 sprints for the PI. So then the team's total delivery capacity is 6 times 30, which is 180 points. That enables us to draw a line under the total scope of what can be delivered or what the team can reasonably commit to. And then once we have the scope established, there is one more step needed, step 6, where we need to estimate a timeline for delivery of each feature. That is needed to construct the art planning board, which is coming up a little bit later. The first thing each team needs to do in the breakout session is to decompose features into user stories. And one approach for this is the technique of user story mapping. And here we refer to the work of Jeff Patton and his book, User Story Mapping. Thoroughly recommend this book. An experienced team likely won't need to take this approach. They'll just propose the stories for each feature. However, this might be a good way to get started for any team that is new to agile development or a team that might be new to the domain that the art is supporting. So we have these 3 basic steps, and in this example, we're going to use a basic e-commerce system as our basic example. So step 1 is to create the backbone of the story map, and here we just create the sequence of activities that a user needs to take to accomplish what they want to do. So in this example, the basic steps are find a product using a search function, review the product details, then if they want to purchase it, move it into some sort of a shopping cart system, and finally go through a checkout process which involves payments and making shipping options. And so step 2 then is define the detailed actions that the users will need to take in each of these steps in the process, and we call these things user stories. So for example, find a product, we're going to search for an item, and we may have options around sorting by price, sorting by ratings, and then for product details, we want to view pictures, images of the product. We want to view user reviews of that product, and we may also want to see related products that we may also want to consider. So these details are the detailed steps, and we could consider those user stories. And then finally, create the so-called MVP, minimum viable product, or minimum viable release. This is where you select a subset of the stories. And to do this, we first of all have to prioritize these stories in order of importance. So we'll select a subset and just simply draw a line under the stories. You can see here we've selected 9 stories that we consider the minimum essential stories to support the feature set for the first initial release. And the 6 items below that line, we can potentially defer those to a later release. So that's basic user story mapping. And the reference here is Jeff Patton and his book, User Story Mapping. Having identified the user stories from our story mapping exercise, the next thing each team needs to do is to come up with estimates for these stories. We need this so we can reconcile the total estimated effort to deliver the requested features with the total available capacity that each team has for the PI. And in fact, this may lead to further adjustments in the selection of stories for delivery. In the example here, we see that we have an estimated 120 points of effort needed to create all of the stories identified. But in this example, the team's velocity is 20 points per sprint. And if we assume 4 sprints, for example, in the PI, then they should commit to only around 80 points in total. This leads us to draw a line below the highest priority stories that amount to around 80 points. Now, obviously, this may lead to having to make some serious compromises and may impact our ability to achieve one or more of the business goals for the PI. Hence, this issue will need to be discussed at the planning reviews following the breakout session and will likely be left as a problem for the leadership team to resolve. Once the team has worked through and refined their plan with the product owner and potentially also the product manager, they can summarize their proposed plan, an example of which is shown in the chart. That is, in this example, they have a total capacity of around 180 points for the PI and hence can only commit to features 1 through 6. And maybe even within that set of features, they may have needed to defer some lower priority stories. The team and their product owner should be aligned on this plan and these priorities as they head into the first pass plan reviews, which immediately follow the team breakout sessions. Let's just stop for a moment to address a common challenge for many teams, and that is, what do we do if we do not have an established velocity that we can use to plan with? So SAFe proposes what they call a capacity-based planning method. In this method, we estimate stories in approximate days of effort. And to do this, we strive to keep most of the stories small, that is, can be developed to a definition of done in a couple of days of effort. In the method, a story that takes a day of development test effort to get to done is a 1-point story. So 1 day of effort equals 1 point. It's as simple as that. We use the Fibonacci series to provide clear separation of different story sizes, and we also adopt a size range of 1 order of magnitude, that is between 1 and 8 points between the smallest and largest stories that will fit in a single sprint. And one thing we don't do is we don't attempt to estimate by breaking the stories into implementation tasks because we simply do not have the time in the PI to do this, and we accept that the estimates will average out over a fairly large number of stories. And so the method is give every full-time developer and tester on the team 8 points, and let's assume 2-week sprints. And thus we assume that only 80% of capacity is available for productive work. basically 1 point per day per person, up to 80% of available capacity in a 10-day iteration. For example, the capacity per sprint for a team of 5 developers and testers is 40 points. So then we subtract 1 point for every vacation day as we get into the specifics of sprint planning across multiple sprints. And so to begin, what we do is we select a small story that would take roughly half a day to code and half a day to test. That is 1 day of total effort to get to done. And we call that a 1 point story. And then we estimate all of the other stories relative to that one. And if it helps, the table at the end shows how we might adopt a simple relative effort sizing of small, medium, large with a corresponding calibration in points. And then revisiting this slide from earlier, we go through exactly the same process to create story and feature estimates, except this time the estimates are from our capacity-based estimation model. Using either approach, we should arrive at roughly the same conclusion about how much of the target feature set we can realistically commit to for the PI. And then once we have reconciled feature estimates with team velocities or capacity, the next step is to come up with a delivery schedule. The process here is to take each feature in order of rank and begin to allocate the stories for that feature into sprints. So for example, let's take the first 2 features. Feature 1 is 5 stories with a total estimate of 16 points. In this example, let's say our capacity is 15 points per sprint. Thus, if feature 1 is 16 points, then it is likely that feature 1 will be completed in sprint 2. And then we continue to populate the sprints with stories to identify which sprint any feature is likely to be completed in. And then once we've completed the feature scheduling step, the data from all teams is then summarized on the art planning board as shown here. As teams go through this process, they may need to consult with other teams where dependencies have been identified. And this, of course, may cause some of the feature delivery sequencing to be adjusted. In the example shown here, we have 6 teams, 5 iterations, and 18 features. Dependencies are indicated by the lines connecting the features. For example, feature 7, which is owned by team 3, has a dependency on feature 10 from team 4. So the art planning board is an important PI planning output artifact, which confirms that dependencies between teams have been accounted for in the overall plan. And this board can then also be used during execution for things like art syncs and PI demos. For example, we might expect to see features 1, 10, and 16 demoed at the end of sprint 2. So now once we've estimated how much of the art backlog we have the capacity to deliver, that is, what features do we have the capacity to create, we should now be in a position to create an initial set of PI objectives for the PI. So PI objectives, teams build features that contribute to business outcomes. PI objectives are business summaries of what business value those features represent. PI objective setting gives teams the opportunity to validate with stakeholders the business value created in the PI and helps to confirm alignment between teams and business stakeholders. PI objectives should be SMART, that is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. At the end of the PI, each team will demonstrate the objectives that were achieved, and these will be scored by business stakeholders. Draft PI objectives should be set once first pass planning has been completed. these objectives can then be finalized and assigned a business value following the planning update step. So here are a couple of examples. So here in the diagram, we see 3 features: high resolution product images with search results, abandoned shopping cart reminders, and product reviews and ratings. All 3 of those features contribute to a single PI objective, namely improvement of sales conversion rates. Then we have site SEO improvements. This is targeted at increasing the number of visitors visiting the site. And then finally, we have some work around test automation, which contributes to the business objective of reducing development costs. Throughout the breakout session, the RTE should be checking in with the teams to confirm they are making progress and to see if any team needs help. To do this, the RTE can set up a brief progress sync call to hear from each team. And this can be based on walking through a simple planning checklist, could be physical or virtual board of some kind, to check progress against each of the major planning tasks. So for example, each team has confirmed its capacity available, stories have been broken out or identified for each feature, story and feature estimates are done or are making progress, overall PI scope has been identified, and then target iterations for each feature have been determined. So we're now able to do the art planning board, dependencies resolved between teams, risks, and then finally draft PI objectives have been done. So we can do this once or a number of times throughout the breakout sessions, and it gives the opportunity to find if we are stuck and to get help for teams that may need help. So now just to recap where we should be right now. So PI planning, the primary input is the art backlog, which is a refined and ranked set of features. Each team will pull their designated features from the backlog and do a couple of things. One, they'll break each feature into a number of stories. Then those stories will be estimated, and those estimates will be rolled up into an overall feature estimate. Having done that, they should be able to estimate which iteration each of those features should be deliverable in based on their actual team velocity or team capacity. During that exercise, the teams will work out dependencies with other teams, and that may necessitate adjusting some of the sequencing of the features. And so that's the art planning board. And then having done that, the next thing to do is to create a set of PI objectives, which are essentially business summaries of what those set of features represent. Next step is to take these outputs from the first pass PI planning and bring those to a review where they will be reviewed by the art and the assembled stakeholders. So then the next event in the planning exercise, once teams have finished their first pass plans, we get everyone back together from the breakout sessions, and we have a draft plan presentation from each team where they'll present the scope of what they can deliver, highlighting any disconnects between what they actually have the capacity to do versus what was requested, and highlight any risks as well that may impede their ability to deliver. And then, of course, also they'll be presenting their initial set of PI objectives that are business summaries of what those features represent. Once that is done, the leadership team will huddle and take a look at the proposed plans and any major risks or dependencies and figure out what actions need to be taken to address those risks, and then be prepared to present those actions to the art when we reassemble for the second part of the planning event. So that wraps up part one of the planning exercise. Next step is to get back together potentially the next day, make adjustments to the plans based on feedback from the leadership team, and then try to align everyone on the art plus stakeholders around a common agreed PI plan. Here we're going to cover the steps needed to align the art on a final plan for the PI, including we'll look at the output from the leadership review meeting, planning adjustments, how to get to a finalized art planning board and an updated set of PI objectives. Then we'll cover the scoring process for the PI objectives. And then finally, we'll look at the risk reviews and confidence vote and how to close out the PI. So based on the leadership review held at the end of the previous session, any actions or adjustments are then presented to the art, and possible changes will include things like changes in business priorities, changes in scope, and the addition or movement of resources across the art, which effectively means changes to team capacities. So then once the output of the leadership review has been presented and discussed across the art, the second breakout sessions occur where teams will work to adjust their plans. So teams then will adjust plans based on changes to scope, priorities, or available capacities. Based on that, they can then update their risks and dependencies, and then adjust or update the PI objectives that were established. Then business owners, business stakeholders will circulate around the teams to assign a business value to the PI objectives. And if it's a big room planning event, that's pretty straightforward. Everyone's in the same room. Otherwise, if it's a virtual event, we can use tools like MS Teams breakout rooms or Zoom breakout rooms or something equivalent. So how do we score PI objectives? Let's first remind ourselves that PI objectives are business summaries of what each delivery team in the art intends to deliver in the next PI. During the second breakout session, business owners will circulate around the teams and will review the objectives and score them, giving them a score between 1 and 10 on a relative basis. The most valuable PI objective for any team will be given a score of 10, and then all remaining PI objectives are scored relative to that first 10. Business value can be either scored as relative within one team or relative to the overall train. Business owners should challenge teams where objectives are not clear or demonstrable, that is, they don't meet the basic SMART criteria. And then at the end of the PI, teams will demonstrate objectives that were achieved. This is in the PI demo event. And business stakeholders will then provide actual scores based on their perception of what was achieved. Actual scores are then used to calculate the predictability metric. Here's an example of how the predictability metric is calculated and used. So one team has 5 PI objectives, scored 10, 9, 5, 3, 1. These objectives were established at the last PI planning event. And at the conclusion of the PI demo event, actual scores of 8, 7, 5, 2, 1 were assigned by business stakeholders. In this example, we get an overall predictability metric of 23/28, which is 82%. So these scores are tracked over each PI on a simple control chart. And let's say the goal over time is to achieve a predictability metric score of, say, 80%. So then if a team is scoring lower than that range, then during the inspect and adapt part of the IP iteration, we should look at root causes of not achieving that score. So here we may use a variety of tools like fishbone diagrams, Pareto charts, 5 whys, and so on. And then we use this analysis to identify a set of improvements or corrective actions to be enacted in the next PI. So to recap on the role of the PI demo and the I&A workshop, Inspect and Adapt workshop. So within each PI, we have a number of delivery iterations. The last iteration is dedicated to innovation and planning. This serves a number of purposes. One, serves as a buffer to finish any uncompleted work or feature development work. At the end of that, we do something called the PI demo, which is where we demonstrate the completed PI objectives that were achieved by each team. During that event, business owners will score each of the objectives, what they actually believe the score was. Out of all that, we can then derive the predictability metric, which is simply the ratio of the actual score over the planned score. And then for those teams that are not achieving their predictability metric of, say, typically 80%, if they're scoring lower than that, we'll take that into the Inspect and Adapt workshop as an exercise to try to get to a root cause, and then use that to identify opportunities for improvement on their delivery performance going into the next PI. So now let's get back to the planning itself. So at the end of the second breakout session, all of the teams will get back together with the business stakeholders to review the updated plan. So here we'll see updates to scope, feature timelines, PI objectives, and any outstanding risks. Business owners will confirm alignment with the updated plans, and here the RTE may ask business owners to accept or reject each plan once they are presented. Any plans that are not accepted will need the teams to continue planning to address any remaining issues after this review. So now we have 2 final steps to take to close out the PI planning event. First of all, we'll have the confidence vote. So once all teams have presented their plans and the risk reviews have been completed and the plans have been accepted by the business owners, we'll have the confidence vote. So this is to gauge the confidence level in the overall plan from the business stakeholders and the delivery teams. For this, we'll use a simple fist of 5 vote. Each person votes by holding up a number of fingers that corresponds to their level of confidence in meeting the PI objectives, ranging from 1, no confidence, and up to 5, very high confidence. If we get any individual votes of 1 or 2, we should hear those individuals, we should hear the concerns, and those concerns should be addressed. And then finally, typically as people are leaving the event, the RTE will facilitate a brief retrospective on the event itself so that improvements can be made for the next event. This should be kept as simple as possible, typically 2 columns, sticky notes to capture comments on what went well, what did not go well, and any suggested improvements. And this concludes section 4, in which we covered, first of all, PI planning goals. We looked at the inputs and outputs into the PI planning event. We looked at the basic process flow, and then we walked through the event agenda in detail, going step by step through each item on the agenda. We spent a bit of time on the IP event, the innovation and planning event, and specifically we focused on the PI demo and how that is used as input to the Inspect and Adapt workshop. So coming up next in the final section, section 5, we're going to cover some of the essentials of how to execute a PI and actually deliver value. We'll see you there shortly.